is talk about some of the methods that you can use to shape and train new behaviors. And a couple of them I'll talk about, like the advantages and the disadvantages of some of the techniques. And we'll spend most of our time talking about the technique called shaping. And then this afternoon, and I'm going to show you some videos of like behaviors in progress and some of the steps that you might take when you're shaping similar behaviors. And some of them you may not ever shape a similar behavior, but you can see the idea of thinking about behaviors in small steps, which is what shaping is. And then this afternoon, you're going to write a shaping plan for what I hope will be a really fun behavior. And a shaping plan is where you actually write out the steps that would be involved in training, and then you'll be exchanging shaping plans with somebody in the room and using their shaping plan to complete the behavior. So when you come back after lunch at 12:30, if you could bring a piece of paper if you don't have one, or a couple of pieces just so you can jot down the shaping plan, and bring a little bit of an appetite or a sweet tooth so that hopefully you will enjoy the activity. It involves food. Okay. So these are some of the methods that you might use to train new behaviors, and I just put selective reinforcement underneath shaping because I'm going to talk a little bit about that as a part of shaping. So just to kind of review what each of these might mean, modeling is when you take the animal's body or the subject's body and actually physically move it into the position that you want. And it might be pulling an animal's wing up, so rather than teaching the animal to maybe extend their wing to a target, you actually take that body part and move it. And I think the biggest advantage of this technique is that the animal, hopefully, you're not forcing it, hopefully learns to relax in the presence of you manipulating its body. So for most of us, or at least me, I know if somebody walks up to me and takes my body part and moves it, if I don't know that person well, I feel a bit uncomfortable with that, and a lot of times I want to pull back. And I don't know if you've experienced that with animals, like when you go to touch them or manipulate their bodies or do something, maybe there's some resistance because they're pulling back. And I think this is probably the biggest disadvantage of modeling, is that it may make the animal uncomfortable if you haven't desensitized them or acclimated them to being handled and manipulated. You may cause the animal to resist and eventually become aggressive if they're not a willing participant in this process. So, those are some of the problems that you may encounter with modeling. Another problem is that the animal isn't really learning to do the behavior. They're sort of learning to let you do the work. And ideally, we would like to have them do the work because then they're voluntarily cooperating and understanding the process. And when an animal's thinking and learning and engaged in problem solving in order to achieve behaviors, that adds a significant enrichment component to the training process. And with modeling, they're not really thinking and learning how to do a behavior, they're just letting you make the movement for them, if that makes sense. So these are just some of the things that I've thought of. For disadvantages, has anybody used this technique? It's not really a technique that I think that I've used with any frequency because of these reasons. I just find there's more effective ways, but I'm always interested in hearing feedback, especially about training new behaviors, because there's so many different ways to do it. And as long as you're not hurting the animal or hurting yourself or causing a problem, generally there isn't a right and a wrong one. Some might be more efficient, some might have a higher enrichment value, with regard to thinking and learning and problem solving. But I'm just always curious, I'd be interested in your feedback on each of these techniques. If you've used them, if you love them, hate them.
One of my friends said that their sea lions, did a lot of sea lions, and it was like magic. You just held the sea lion's flipper out, bridged it, and said, really? Okay. And I know, that was magic with the sea lions.
Huh. For other behaviors, or primarily that flipper present?
I don't remember the specific one, but we were talking about, because we were working with birds at the time, and I said it's very difficult to do with birds. guards.
Yeah,
But with, she said with the sea lion, just like push them in a certain position and they're like, oh yeah, I got it. But it reminds me of people trying to teach their dog to sit by shoving their butt down.
right, right.
I think the relationship is the biggest disadvantage because I have used this a lot with macaws, like training wing trims. But I have liked it also for them wanting to hold that wing open the entire time for a trim is not really what they do. So in terms of being able to training the hold for that was easier by training the hold up versus open your wing and then let me grab it. So that was easier there, but the relationship meant only the very few people that work with it every day could actually do it.
Yeah, and I expect the same was true with sea lions. I mean, there can be some really aggressive sea lions that aren't going to want to be pushed and pulled. So yeah, I think those sound like they could be great examples, but the relationship and the animal's personality are going to be huge if you're thinking about using this technique. And again, I think, as we start to talk about shaping and the use of targets and things like that, kind of that learning to learn is important. I mean, if you teach an animal to move its flipper out or move its wing out, and then maybe you want to use modeling, kind of to hold the animal and support it, maybe that's an effective way to do it, as long as they're not trying to pull back on you. But anyway, yeah, thanks for your examples. Okay, the second technique I kind of want to mention is, and I don't know if I'm just making this up, but I've experienced this a lot working in different facilities, is what I call distraction, wherein, in this example, the animal was actually trained to enter the crate, but it's hard to find a picture of distraction. So, if you want to close an animal in a crate or a squeeze or something, you're feeding them, and then you have your partner come up and close the door. So you're kind of trapping them, but they're distracted enough by the food, and you're pumping food in them, that they're not really paying attention to what's happening, or they decide that the value of the food is worth staying. A lot of people will do this with injections. So you're feeding the animal. This is sideways, but when I practiced, it flipped around. And of course it's not going to flip around there. Why does it do it here? Okay, well anyway, she's feeding the bear and working on doing some injection training. So in this case, she's not desensitizing the bear. She's not, let me touch you, bridge, reinforce. She's feeding, 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 reach up, grab. Feeding, 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 reach up, grab. So that's why I call it distraction. You're distracting the animal. They're not really paying attention. Oh, something's happening back here, but I'm not totally paying attention to it. And what I find is that, you come up to the animal, I don't want to touch your actual food.
No.
So, I'm feeding, 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 bam, I give you an injection. Maybe you go, oh, what was that? I'm not sure if I liked it so much. The next time I come back and start to do this, one of two things is probably going to happen. Either the animal's going to keep eating because they're okay with it, or they might be like, oh no, I don't trust you now at all because you surprised me that other time. So it can certainly, have some disadvantages. I'll come back to that. During the procedure, the animal may decide the food isn't worth being distracted for. The animal may, not trust you anymore because you just surprised them, those sorts of things. The advantages are you may actually get to your goal quickly. If you have a knockdown coming up, you need to inject an animal, you've decided that this technique, because you've been able to feed them and kind of touch them like you saw with the bear, you've decided that it's going to be worth it because we don't want to dart them or do something else that may be worse. So you decide that for this particular instance, I'm going to go ahead and use this technique. But understand there may be some drawbacks in that the animal doesn't trust you next time, or now in order to actually train it, you may actually have to start even further back than at kind of a neutral 0 point. And I have seen animals that were trained, for blood draws, and the sea lion, again, he's the one that really comes to mind, big male sea lion. He would lay out and put his back flippers out, and as long as you were cranking food into him, he didn't seem to mind the needles or the manipulation or anything else that was happening. So, it can work, but I think the risks are considerable. oops, before I go on, any comments or successes or failures or thoughts on distraction?
What comes to mind is our T-Touch person that comes and visits elephants as well as a few of the reptiles and things. She does that with Hogan, the monitor. Sets out a bowl of food while he's eating and has been working on touching him, which is great because she can get her hands on him. And it's really hard to figure out a way to do that same thing without using that. So it's a challenge to try to get around that.
Yeah. But has he shown any, is the experience in itself reinforcing? The T-Touch itself reinforcing? Or is he just down for his food and doesn't really care because it's not particularly painful? I'm assuming it should feel
It's
good.
hard to tell.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that T-Touch is, and I'm not convinced that T-Touch is reinforcing itself. Not convinced that it's not reinforcing, but I'm not convinced that it reinforces yet.
Yeah, it's not annoying enough, so he's happy to sit there and eat while it goes on.
So it seems,
Yeah, yeah.
So,
But you probably wouldn't be able to achieve that without
No.
the distraction.
No.
Without
We haven't been able to try it either, but
Yeah.
it's one of those, do we just keep going with it because we might be able to get to a goal of touching his feet, or do we want to try to step back and try to do it classically? It's also a thought that we've had. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I would have my opinions on it, I'm sure. Okay, so the third technique that I'm going to talk about is social learning. And social learning can be really helpful when maybe you have a really frightened animal. One animal can watch another one learn something, and maybe that social learning experience will help the animal learn more quickly. So I think there's stories of, killer whale calves learning to do the whole show simply by following their moms through a show. We've seen it a lot with primates. It's a super interesting area for study, I think. One project that I was working on was urine collection with chimpanzees, and we were looking at how quickly they would learn to do the behavior. And honest to God, I don't know how many of y'all have trained urine collection, but some of them learn it like that. Oh, you want me to pee? Okay, all you had to do was ask. Some of them, you give them gallons and gallons of juice, thinking that eventually they're going to have to go, and 2 hours later they're still sitting there, have not peed at all. So it's an interesting behavior to train, but this one project I was helping with, we had chimps that were just learning, like you would train them to urinate on command without anything else going on in the area. Some learned watching videos of other chimps doing it and not getting reinforced. Some watched videos of other chimps doing the behavior and getting reinforced. And then some were in an enclosure with others that were doing the behavior and getting reinforced. And there was considerable difference in how quickly they learned to do the behavior when they could see somebody else, especially somebody else getting reinforced. So it was pretty interesting stuff. But anyway, the idea is that they learn more quickly by watching somebody else do a behavior. So just watch the gal on the left. She was not trained for toothbrushing at that point in time, but she's obviously watching. Whoa, twice. Okay, questions about social learning or comments? Amber? Have you experienced that for those of you working with group house social animals?
The otters. They're
Otters.
very, very much social learners, though, because we train them all usually one at a time, but it's in a chain link mesh so they can see each other there. And they may not necessarily be comfortable with each of the behaviors, but when they watch the cues from the keepers, they watch their siblings do it, they catch on pretty quick.
We need to document some of this stuff. There's documented with primates and, like I said, marine mammals, particularly cetaceans, but it would be really neat to systematically document some of the learning and how it can be enhanced. I think as a standalone technique, an animal may learn a chain of behaviors or get more comfortable with something, so I don't think it's an effective standalone, but it sure seems like it can help animals learn more quickly, especially those that are a little either shy or scared of people, or, you know, for whatever reason they need more time to kind of get used to the process.
Yeah, probably, maybe like when we were training the zebras to go into the back stall by themselves, some were not as confident doing it on their own, so going with a buddy, and then, yeah, that would also happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, herd animals who are meant to run away from scary things, you know, having a buddy there to help you through it's gotta be huge for them.
I've seen it with domestic cats at home. I've always had lots of cats, and when I trained them, I had one particular tabby that was like super smart, and I wasn't training him, and he was watching, and then he started doing all this stuff. And I was like, okay. Great.
Oh, that's really cool.
Uh-huh.
Clever little thing. Okay, awesome. Well, bribing, I know we've had entire hours together where we've talked about bribing, but of course it is a technique that we can use to train animals, and a lot of people think it's a bad thing, and I know I've said this in previous lectures, bribing is not a bad thing. It's important to understand what it is. You know, you offer a bribe, something the animal wants, a reinforcer, a reward, you offer them something, and they move towards that something to do the correct behavior. So you use this bribe to elicit the behavioral response that you want. Whoa. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so bribes, I think they do have a place in positive reinforcement training, but you don't want to get dependent on them because, you know, like your tabby cat, I mean, these animals, I think most of the times they're way smarter than I am. I don't know if you feel that way, but most animals make me feel pretty dumb. And they're super smart, they have a plan, they know what they're doing, and if we become dependent on bribing, the animal may hold back for a bigger and bigger bribe. I think we've talked about that in previous discussions. So bribes are okay to use, but you need to have a plan to eliminate them. So make sure that you have a reinforcer that you'll use when the animal does the behavior, not to elicit the behavior. So you have your bribe. Try to have your bribe of lesser value to the animal than the reinforcer. So I make the movement for one grape, but then I get a whole handful of grapes for reinforcement. Assign a cue right from the beginning. So if you're going to use a bribe to teach an animal to shift, you put the food down, you say shift, the animal moves to get the food, you bridge and reinforce with that greater value reinforcer than what you had for the bribe. So they're okay to use, just make a plan to eliminate them. So I know I've showed you this video before, but again, just watch the position of the meat. She's moving the meat up and down and all around in order to kind of, he doesn't quite do it, and then when she moves the meat, the animal goes ahead and makes the behavior, and you'll really see it clearly on the get on the scale behavior.
Scale. Scale.
So really obvious he's following the bribe there. And once again, I think I've said this every time I show this video, she's an excellent trainer, and when I showed her the video, she was horrified, like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I was, you know, holding the food right there. So we just quickly took some steps back and went back to the cues that were established. And you can see the meat's still kind of there, but she's also cueing. And in this case, it's for shift over, and he comes right over. And I've also shown you, some of you who are here may have seen this video. It's teaching a bear to do an open mouth. Open mouth is typically an easy behavior to bribe as a way to get it started, and then you can fade the bribe out. And you know, for most animals, we use something like this or this as the open cue. So you can present the cue and the food, or you can even, in this case, you'll see she has a biscuit between her fingers and she's saying open, and then you just simply fade the food away and have the cue. So that's what you'll see in these two videos. So the little kibbles in her hand there, and you can tell she's still bridging. And actually, I will say one comment, one thing I will say, when I bribe open, With some animals, I will purposefully not give them the bribe that's, in that case with the bear, I might actually go for a different bit of food that I have. That way they're not always looking just at your hands. But again, it kind of, every situation is a little bit different, and you'll see from this video, the bear makes the transition very well. Now she's just doing the open, and he does it perfectly. So normally I would suggest, if you have the food to bribe, go ahead and put it down and give them something else. Or if you do give them the bit in your hand, make sure you follow up so that they get more better as reinforcement. So this was a kind of weird attempt to try to make a transport hammock, I don't know what you would call it, for the bats here. We wanted to be able to pull some of the bats and weigh them or move them to a particular location. So we made this thing that they actually ended up getting caught in. It was more trouble, didn't quite work out. Some design flaw issues, but the point is you can see the bats being bribed onto the device. And he actually did get on it, and then because it was netting, he got caught in it. So then we had to peel him out, so it wasn't a very positive experience. Does anybody have any comments on bribing? I feel like we've spent a bit of time on it, but if anybody wants to discuss anything about it more, that's what we're here to do. But I just wanted to mention it as, one of your techniques for training.
I guess just for consistency, what would you say the big negatives of bribing are? Just that it's not having to follow a cue,
Yeah, the negatives are when, if you need to do something that you either can't use a lot of food to do, the animal now is not seeing the food or whatever you're using for bribes, so then they refuse to make the move. And I think one of the times we use bribing the most is for shifting. And you get in that situation where you're in a big hurry, and the animal looks and is like, no, not quite enough. And then you put more down, and they're like, not quite enough. And you're in a big hurry that day, so then you put even more down. And then they're like, oh, cool, okay, now I've just learned that if I pulled out, you're going to keep putting more and more down. So that's the part where animals are super smart, and they end up training us. So, I think that's where it's okay to use bribes to initiate some behaviors, but you want to try to have a plan to get rid of it, because becoming dependent on it, it can be really difficult to fade out later. So I think that's probably the main problem with it, is kind of our time crunch. We're usually in a hurry, and it's easy to just put more and more food down when you're in a hurry.
I have a question. Is it bribing, like when we're shipping the elephants up and we're shaking the bucket with alfalfa, but they're not getting the alfalfa yet? Would you say that's a bribe?
That topic sort of always comes up. And, are you going to come to work if you're not sure if you're getting paid or not?
Yeah.
So to me, that's like kind of saying payday's coming.
Like they know they're gonna get it.
And they know, they should know that, I'm not of the mindset that you have to hide the food all the time, because they should know they're gonna get paid. And so, yeah, it becomes more of the cue, is the shaking the bucket, and yeah, I've got food, and if you come up here, you're gonna get it. But, so it's if they don't make the move,
Then I bribe them.
then you start throwing food down, and then they see the food and they can readily access it. Because the thing is, when you've got the bucket of food, they can't get it. And they probably know that. So, yeah, it's the promise of payment, I think. Is that a bribe? Or is it a cue?
If they're not listening to it and then you have to keep giving them more, it turns into a bribe.
Yeah.
But if they're treating it like a cue, then it's a cue,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We also don't know how much they're getting of the bucket. Are they getting one piece or the whole bucket?
Yeah.
I have seen bribing there. But that situation, I would agree that the shaky sound and the bucket, this is the cue. You come here and now you get 5 pieces or 1 piece, and I think that's different.
Yeah. And, the other thing that I sometimes do, and, hello, I'm Margaret, I bribe. I don't know if I need to go to BA or what. But, you know, if an animal takes one move, you bridge and you reinforce, but you reinforce a little bit further away because you want them to keep, like elephants moving up the pathway. They have to move quite a long distance, or other animals that maybe have to move a long distance. So you want to keep them going, but you need to provide reinforcement along the way. So you bridge when they take a step, you throw the food down, but you throw it enough that they have to make another couple of steps, then you bridge and you throw the next bit. So your reinforcement could also be bribing further movement. But again, hopefully, under normal circumstances, you know, if there's not some big stressful thing happening that's making it difficult for them to move, you would use that less and less, or have greater distances that they would travel before they get the reinforcement / bribe. That makes sense. So yeah, I think it definitely becomes a little bit muddied and confusing there. Excellent. Okay, so capturing is our next technique. Capturing is simply when you see a behavior and you bridge and reinforce it. Just when we were working with the Siamangs today, we want to train leg present, so they're sitting, they just happen to be sitting with their leg against the mesh. Touch it, bridge, reinforce. That's capturing. You see it happening, you bridge and reinforce it. When you capture, you of course want to, similar to bribing, you want to assign a cue. So the animal's sitting there with his leg against the mesh, leg, good. So you're still using that bridge cue and bridge and reinforcement. You're just not necessarily waiting for the animal to do the move because they're already in the position. One of the problems, probably the biggest problem with capturing, is that if there's regression, which so often there is, and it's normal, don't panic. If there's regression, if you've captured a behavior, you don't really have a way to go back and retrain it. You sort of just have to wait for the animal to do it again. And if you can't figure out what circumstances occurred to have that animal do the behavior, you may have quite a frustrating time trying to get them to repeat it again. Again, with the Siamangs, they make a pretty good example because they have such long arms and short little legs, and in this case we're working in sort of a small area, the chute area, so it's maybe this long and this tall, much shorter than their long arms. And they want to, you know, they can move and hold on to things and not necessarily put their bodies in the right position. One of the things we talked about this morning was we spent 90% of the session trying to get them to turn their body so their leg would be there. And then the couple of times where they just happened to sit, he just happened to sit and turn with his leg in the right position, perfect, capture it, but there's no real learning what happened there. Does he really understand you were talking about my leg? And then if you were to actually ask for the leg, would he understand to bring it forward? Or, you know, so that's what I mean when there's no kind of learning to learn and no pathway of how they got from A to Z when you capture, only that they did it. So that's probably the biggest drawback of it. Oh, I already said all those things. Of course, some behaviors can only be trained by capturing because they're difficult to shape. And that would include things like urinating on command, vocalizing, things like that. It's hard to, you might shape it to be louder, longer, less latency, but to actually get that first drop of urine, you really just have to capture it. You might do things to stack the deck in your favor, know what time of day an animal typically urinates, give them a bunch of liquids or juices or water or whatever so that they're more likely to urinate within a reasonable time frame. But you really just have to wait for it to happen, and then bridge and reinforce when it does.
I just like to talk. Would another downside to this?
Chance to have coffee,
Yeah.
so I'm good with it.
Would another downside be accidentally capturing other aspects of behavior that you might not necessarily want? Because I've seen that as well with capturing wing opens for macaws. They'll do that as an aggressive display, so people will try to capture that, but then you're also reinforcing them for displaying
Yeah.
in an aggressive manner, so.
Yeah, and again, birds and sea lions are coming up a lot. So when we train sea lions to vocalize, you kind of stand back and they get pissed and go, "Mah!" You know, because they want the food. So yeah, you have to, in some cases, maybe you have to annoy the animal, or if it's something like that. Yeah, and so I do think that can absolutely be a drawback. I think most of the time, depending on the situation a bit, most of the time, if they are a little frustrated and doing some display that you want to capture, most of the time when the positive reinforcement starts to come for it, that will diminish, but certainly that's not always going to be the case. So that is something to be on the lookout for. And I mean, really, you kind of hate to be frustrating animals to get them to do a particular behavior when there might be another way to train it. So yeah, excellent point. Okay, again, I think I've shown you these two slides of training giant anteaters to urinate on command. The keeper noticed that they would often urinate when they were getting their little mist bath in the morning, and so he was able to capture it and then put it on a cue and collect urine whenever he needed. The reason I have this slide up is it was actually this orangutan at a zoo where I was consulting, and he would present his right arm super reliably, and it had been captured. And she could say arm, and he would bring his arm forward. And so she kept saying arm, arm, and he would not bring his left arm forward. She's like, but this is a smart orangutan. Shouldn't he be able to make the leap of this arm to this arm? But he didn't. And I think in large part because he wasn't trained on body targets, so he didn't really understand the idea of bringing his arm towards an object. He just knew that, oh, I get stuff when I put this arm up against the fence. And he hadn't learned it through shaping and have this foundation of learning. So when she started asking for the other arm and he wasn't making the moves and he wasn't getting reinforced, then he got super frustrated and mad. So we had to go back and use body targets and shape the other arm. And he learned it super fast. But that's just kind of another drawback of capturing and then thinking that you're just automatically going to transfer it to the other side. It's much easier to transfer a concept like body targeting. So if I've been trained to lift this foot towards a target, and then it may only take one touch with the target, and oh, same thing over here, and oh, okay, now my shoulder towards the target. So that concept, generalizes with targeting. Whereas with capturing, that's not probably going to be the case. Sometimes it might be. But yeah, it was interesting because this guy just absolutely no clue. And you think orangutans are pretty smart. Any other comments? Okay, so now we'll spend the rest of the hour talking about shaping. And I think shaping is the most useful training technique. And we shape behaviors by successive approximations. Successive approximations are small steps that build towards your final behavioral objective. So one of the things that you want to get really good at is thinking about behavior as made up of lots and lots of small steps. The most common mistake that newer trainers make is that the steps are too big. So if you feel like an animal just isn't able to get from one point to another in the training process, it may be that you're trying to make that step from one part of the behavior to the next a little bit too big, and maybe you need to divide it into some smaller steps. So animals get this really strong foundation. Even if the behavior degrades at some point in the process, you still have that strong foundation of the early training. And so typically you can go back and retrace those steps with pretty high success and typically in a shorter amount of time than you initially train the behavior. We all learn through repetition. Hopefully, if you're hearing me say the same things over and over again or seeing the same videos over again, maybe you're remembering it a little better or thinking about it in a slightly different way because you're not just hearing the words now, you're starting to think about the concepts. And the same holds true for animals. They're going to start to understand the concepts as they experience things repeatedly. Another strong point, I think, that makes a behavior that's been shaped with successive approximations very strong, persistent behavior is that positive reinforcement is associated with all of those steps. and we say positive reinforcement training has tremendous staying power. So animals remember it, and they don't need necessarily to be reminded of all the small steps because of that strong foundation and the strong association with positive reinforcement. And my example, I would love to hear if y'all have any similar kinds of things of kind of the staying power of positive reinforcement and shape behaviors is way back I used to train sea lions, and I had been gone from the Houston Zoo where I worked for a long time. I'd been gone from there for a number of years, and the sea lion that I had worked with a lot, for some reason her vocalization, I trained her on just like I would show her my fist like this, and a bunch of other sea lions came in and they were already trained to vocalize it, and theirs was this. So we transferred her over. And I went back to visit, and they're like, hey, you want to train Gertie? Sure, I love Gertie, why wouldn't I want to? So I trained Gertie, and I said, I'm just going to see what happens. And I showed her my fist like this, and it had been close to 10 years since she had been cued that way, and immediately, bah! So she absolutely remembered that behavior. So, tremendous staying power with positive reinforcement training. And actually the same sort of situation with a couple of other sea lions that I had worked with, and we shifted their cues and some of their training to be like the majority of the other animals because they were trained differently, and it's easier to have everybody doing the same thing. So, I don't know, I think it's really, again, fascinating behavior learning. It's also interesting and how an animal remembers things and processes this information that we're giving them. But yeah, positive reinforcement has staying power. Does anybody have anything you want to share? It's like story time. Experiences with that, Amber?
I remember me. That's surprising.
Did you have one?
I do. You first, yeah.
I did not have my hand up for the record.
As I was saying her name, I saw her name. Please share.
I recently started working with Maggie Giraffe, and she's been trained extensively in the past, and she is showing me things that she remembers from 3 to 4 years ago, like very quickly, very clearly.
Yeah.
Yes, I know this, and she's very eager, and it's exciting to see something after 3 years that hasn't been asked for, and there it is. So.
And she's probably excited to have the opportunity to do that and interact and earn the positive stuff. Cool. If a giraffe can do it, anybody can.
They're smart, man. They're manipulators too.
They are. Sometimes they hide it, but they are. Okay, I already mentioned generalization. And with shaping, I like to remind myself and maybe y'all that you want to start in kindergarten. We didn't start with calculus, we started with 1 + 1. So start easy, build up an animal's confidence, let them learn this crazy training game we're trying to teach them, give them the opportunity to learn how the tools function, learn what a target is, learn what a body target is, all of those kinds of things, and you build that good, strong foundation, and then it's going to be much easier to teach them the more difficult, scary, painful things that, maybe we need to get to that injection right now because the vets want to do an exam, but if you can't teach them to present their body part and hold it, it's going to be more difficult to just jump straight to the injection. And you don't want their first experience to be painful or frightening. So start easy and then build up to the more difficult things. And really that's what the tiers do for us anyhow. So that's convenient. Okay, have y'all read Don't Shoot the Dog? Everybody's read it? Okay, I mean it's a great book, easy read. I think to me kind of some of the best take-home points of it are the laws for shaping. Me being not always a law-abiding citizen, I like to call them guidelines. And I will tell you which ones I feel are, in my experience, I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm just saying in my experience I don't feel like they need to be a law. But raise the criteria in small increments. Yes, small steps. This is what I was mentioning earlier. You don't want to confuse an animal or frustrate an animal or just blow them out of the water for whatever reason because your steps are too big. So take the time to write out a shaping plan. It's a really good exercise to put yourself through repeatedly. And I think with the training committee, one of the things that we're gonna do, if you don't already have access to them, is make available a number of different types of shaping plans. So you can use those, excuse me, as an example or a guideline as you're creating your own shaping plans. And again, it can be a pain to sit down and write a shaping plan, but it really does teach you to think about behavior in lots of small steps. So if you're new to training or old to training, I suggest you stay in the habit of practicing writing shaping plans. Write a shaping plan for a behavior you've never trained before, and compare that to some of the existing ones. So, but small steps are better than big steps. Really important, you want to train one aspect of the behavior at a time. There were only a couple of you that were at the training game yesterday. So one of the last behavior that we trained in the training game involved somebody standing in one spot and touching their toe or touching their foot. And with a behavior like this, there's two parts of it. One is stopping and getting in a particular orientation. Maybe it's facing sideways or towards the group. But get the animal to stand in one place first, and then they need to make the move. If you're trying to reinforce them for making the move and standing still, that's going to be very confusing. So most of the behaviors that we're training consists of multiple parts. Injection training requires holding your body position still for an extended period of time, and then allowing that body part to be touched and poked with the needle and eventually injected. So those are two different parts of the behavior. One is the position, one is the needle desensitization. You don't want to try to train those both at the same time. You want to train one part and then train the other part and then combine them. This is the point that I think is more of a guideline. I think when we've talked about continuous and variable schedules last time or the time before, I may have mentioned that I, for the most part, function within the context of a continuous schedule of reinforcement while varying the magnitude. And although sometimes I absolutely do use a variable schedule, but in my experience, I'm not saying it's the wrong way to do it, but in my experience, I have not found it necessary to put one step of my shaping plan on a variable schedule purposefully before moving to the next step. So that one's more of a guideline. I'll use injection training again for this example. So when you're introducing a new aspect of the behavior, you might want to relax the criteria of another. So if you're teaching injection, you've got the animal presenting their body part, you're able to poke it with the blunt needle for 20 seconds. And now you've decided you're ready to actually pierce the skin with a small needle. Are you going to pierce the skin and expect the animal to hold for 20 seconds? No. Relax the criteria of duration, do a stick, come right out. And then you build back up to the duration that you need. And so in that example, each time I would introduce a larger size needle, I would relax the duration criteria and build back up. So that's what we mean by relax one aspect of the behavior while building up a new one. Staying ahead of your subject, again, animals are super smart, and so having a shaping plan will help you stay ahead of them, because if you know what your next 5 steps are, then if the animal takes a significant leap in the training process, you're ready to move forward. And so that might not only mean the actual steps of the behavior, but if it's a veterinary behavior, you want to make sure that you've discussed things with the vets, you've got the right position, you've got the right equipment, you've got the animal, facing the right way, whatever it might be. Because again, there's nothing, I think, more frustrating than having felt like you've done the behavior perfectly, you've got it completed, and then the vet goes, oh, that's nothing like what we needed. Did you understand what I said? You go, well, I thought I did. So, check with the vets, make sure that you've got the proper plan in place before you start training it. And you never know, an animal may take a big leap and suddenly you're there and you didn't think you were going to be. So you don't want your lack of planning to hold up progress. One primary trainer per behavior. There are a number of different ways to decide how you want your training program to look and how your primary trainers work. Typically, it's best to have one person train a new behavior to completion and then transfer that behavior to other people, so that obviously just one person isn't the only one who can do it. Some behaviors may require multiple people. If that's the case and you don't have enough staff or the luxury of having the same 2 people every time you want to do training, or maybe you don't have the same 2 people that 1 day a week and you want to train 4 days a week, try to have at least one person that's consistent, and that person is usually best to stay in the same role. Like if you're working on a blood draw, maybe you have one person who's doing the blood draw, one person who's maintaining the position of the animal and providing reinforcement. So that person maintaining the position of the animal might be the consistent person, and they're there for every single session. They know how the animal did in the previous session, what the plan is for this session, and then they can direct the other person. So, but try to have as much consistency as possible. One of the, I guess, things that really will slow down your training is inconsistency. If people are reinforcing the animal for doing different things, you know, some people might be a little easier on them, some people might push them a little harder to move things forward. So the animal's getting reinforced for this spectrum of behaviors, and really you want to move in a particular direction. You can have, you know, when you're thinking about your, I guess, how your training is going to go, you might be the primary trainer for one animal and all the behaviors on that animal. Or you might train blood draw on this individual, turn around on this individual, and somebody else is training your blood draw animal on a turnaround. So it's still, you're the primary for a new behavior, whether you're primary on the animal or primary on a behavior with an animal is kind of what works best for your section and situation. Of course, you know, we've been talking about shaping plans. You want to have a shaping plan, and I like to say give your shaping plan a fair chance to succeed before changing it. Because if you're thinking like, oh, I've done this twice and it's not working, and you're just always changing your training session, that can be really confusing to the animal. And they're trying to figure out what you want them to do, but if you're always changing what your expectation is, it's very difficult for them to figure out. So make a shaping plan. I mean, don't be married to it, but be sort of devoted, so that you can give it a fair chance to succeed. If it's not succeeding, or you feel like the animal's really struggling with it, then alter your shaping plan, but do it in a, not consistent, but do it in a planned way, you know, so maybe you have to actually write down your changes to your shaping plan, or if you make changes during your training session, go ahead and document those. Oh, this is how I changed my shaping plan. Because that not only will be helpful to you if regression occurs and you have to retrace steps with that particular animal and that particular behavior, but that might also be really valuable information down the line when you're gone or no longer working with that animal. Somebody can look back in the records and see, or just in the greater good of helping somebody else who's training a similar behavior. You can share your experiences with how it went for you and that animal. This, I think, is an important point whether you're working on a shaping a new behavior or in any training session or training moment. You don't want to end a training session gratuitously. You know, you want to try to end on a positive note, let the animal, you know they've done a good job. You don't want to frustrate them with a training session or frustrate them with a new behavior. Go back to a point where they can end on a positive note. And if, you know, your phone rings, the radio goes off, whatever it might be, somebody calls you, if I'm there working with you and we're having a good time, oh wait, I gotta answer my phone, hello? Yeah, no, I'm training. Oh no, she's great, she doesn't care. Well, maybe the animal just feels like they've gotten a timeout. So if something happens that you have to interrupt your training session earlier than what you had intended, you know, do something nice. At least tell the animal, hey, good job. Here's a couple of little pieces. I'm going to leave you with something. I got to go. So that they don't feel like they are being timed out and punished for something. We've talked about this. If regression happens, go back to the point in the shaping plan where the animal's comfortable, and just simply build back up. And I talked about that as well. Okay, questions, comments on those guidelines, laws of shaping?
Is the only one that you marked as a guideline was the variable schedule, or did you say any others?
That's the biggie for me. You know, some of the others I think apply to the greater context of training, not just shaping. Yeah, I think to me, kind of the most important points of those are small steps. It's better to have more small steps, even if it's a pain in your backside, to write it down on your shaping plan. It's better to have more small steps and be descriptive about what they are than to have fewer big steps. And keeping it positive and kind of understanding the personality of the animal so that you know when to push. Because with shaping or desensitization, you're always in the position of pushing the animal a little bit, because you don't want to get stuck at step number 5 when you have 6 through 12 still to go. And if 5 to 6 is a hard step, at some point you have to push them a little bit. And they may fail a couple of times, but that's okay. I mean, failure is not a bad thing. It's an opportunity to learn. You don't want them to get frustrated by the failure, but let them kind of sort it out and have the opportunity to learn. And again, that I think is where the enrichment value of training really comes through. I mean, training is great, and if you think of training as a management tool, you may think of it one way, but if you think of it as an enrichment strategy, you know, is doing the same behaviors over and over every single day enriching? Maybe a little bit, but not as enriching as problem solving and thinking and, you know, learning a new behavior. Okay, so typically when we are, slide here twice, that is weird. Okay, I'm distracted by what's going on my screen. So oftentimes when we're, you know, starting out a training program, we may start by training animals to touch a target or to touch body targets as kind of a second step. And, you know, we've talked about targets before, but just kind of as a reminder, some of the reasons that we might use targets. I'm not sure if I showed you this video, but watch the hip target. I'm real glad that's not my arm. She's not being aggressive, she's just done a good lean in. And this is an elephant with previously broken back leg, her foot's all weird. So once she gets in that position, she just sort of stays. But it's a good reminder why we want to use targets and not get between an animal and a hard spot. And I know that I showed you this video once before, but I think it's a good reminder when you're using targets, it is a tool. It is a significant tool to the animal. Pay attention to what you're doing with it. If you're not using it, put it down in a way so that the animal's not distracted by it. This is a giraffe who's just learning to do an A to a B. So there's somebody standing with the first target, and they say go, and the giraffe turns and goes to the second target. But watch the giraffe and the target up here. So he's asking for target, animal targets. Okay, you see the target's waving around up here.
Put the target down.
See the giraffe's looking at the target? Oh, okay. Put the target down. Now go. Eventually the giraffe does try to go. Whoa. But that animal, and I see that a lot with giraffe and elephant, maybe because we're using really long targets oftentimes, and sometimes you might not have enough room to plop it down, and you'll see the animals kind of looking at it like, wait, I thought I just learned to touch that, and now you're asking me to leave, but still holding this thing around. So just watch what you do with them. They can be very important to the animals and an important tool. You don't want to train them to ignore it by holding it in a kind of sloppy way. So when you start introducing targets to animals, you know, you might just present it in front of them, and they'll begin to move towards it. Even a little raise. other than elephants and chimpanzees in here. This was a super aggressive little elephant, and she just really wanted to kill the target. So she kept hitting at it with her nose. And of course, the part that we want to reinforce is when she gently touches it with her face, rather than, you'll see her hit it in the beginning, no reinforcement, and then there's the bridge. Okay, so we want to not only introduce the target, reinforce the animal for moving towards it, but for moving towards it gently and for touching it with the appropriate body part. Some animals, giraffes, the lemurs will tend to reach out and grab. Giraffes will reach out and grab the target with their tongue. They get just close enough to it, they're like, oh, here, I'll just go ahead and finish this up. They know it has to go on their nose, but they sort of cheat by pulling it forward. So you want to watch for those things as well. And how you're going to do this and get the behavior the right way, the right way being not grabbing it with your hand and bringing the target to you, but actually walking up and touching the target. You might achieve this through what's called selective or differential reinforcement. And with selective or differential reinforcement, same thing, you're selecting the higher quality of the behavior to reinforce. So whatever the higher quality is for that behavior, if it's touching a target, it might be touching it gently, it might be touching it with the proper body part, it might be not grabbing it and bringing it forward. So you're going to select those aspects of the behavior to reinforce, and it's really important that you're consistent and you don't reinforce the lower quality. So if when the animal grabs the target and brings it towards their nose, you don't want to bridge that. And you may think, but they touched it, but no, that's not what you want. Again, if you're bridging this broad spectrum of behaviors, then the animal isn't going to learn to do it the proper way. So you have to be consistent, tough love kind of, but really it's helping the animal get to where you need them to be. All right, so here is an example. This is not, again, some of these things when I go to talk about them, usually the moments pass and I go, oh, I wish I had videoed that because I just missed a great opportunity for differential reinforcement or whatever term it might be that I want to describe. So it's a little bit hard to catch this on video, but here you'll see this little macaque. He's learning to present his foot. And he grabs the target with the hand, she bridges. She's like, oh, don't want the hand. So wait, hand comes away, bridge and reinforce the part of the behavior you want, which is only the foot on the target. Okay, so, and again, I think this is one of those times where, you're accidentally going to bridge things that you wish you hadn't. If that happens, just don't feed the animal. So she waits. Okay, and then he gets reinforced. And this guy is doing an open mouth, and she's trying to get a slight bit more duration. And I think I've shown you this mandrill before. He's quite aggressive, quite spastic, just moving all the time. Really hard to get the timing of the bridge in for an open mouth, and then to get him to do something other than and back was really challenging. So watch the video and you'll see she eventually gets the perfect bridge in to get the slightest amount of duration. And she's bribing it open with the juice bottle. Open. See, that would have been one to bridge, but she missed it. Open. Oh. And that was another one. She's like, oh, I wish I'd bridged that. And he hasn't gotten reinforced, so he was trying to offer some other behaviors. So there she got it in, and gets a nice big jackpot. I mean, it's the slightest bit more of an open, but she's selecting just that split second longer to reinforce. So that's how selective reinforcement works, and that's how you begin to improve the quality, whatever the quality for the behavior is. Like I said, it might be response time, it might be duration, it might be intensity, whatever it is. This is what you want to think about when you're moving a behavior forward. Okay? Any questions so far? So now what I want to do is just with several different behaviors is take you through some of the steps in the shaping plan, how you would go through this. And what I'm going to do first is just show you some hip target training, and it's obviously not all with one animal, not all with one species, but you can kind of get an idea of how you might train an animal to do a lean in or present its hip. Okay, so the first thing is teaching that animal that when the hip target touches, good things happen. So all you're going to do is reach in, touch the animal. Okay, you're not teaching them to move. Hopefully you're not teaching them to not move. But the idea is you're pairing the touch with the positive reinforcement. Okay, so this is the very first step. Some animals you may have to desensitize to the point where you can actually get that target in with them. You can see he's watching the second target. So at this point, all we're doing is lifting it and putting it in towards his hip, but not actually even touching him with it yet. This is at the Seoul Zoo. They think they're saving tigers because they have about 40 of them. No, I don't think it's that many. 26. Okay, so this animal is quite new to training. You can see there's other tigers just all along there. When I work lean in with a lot of species, particularly big cats, it's really nice to have a long distance to work them because they sort of naturally want to walk along the fence line. And so if you can lead them along the fence line and then get that second hip target in, that can be a really good way to start that behavior. Okay, whereas some other animals, we may be able to have them stay more stationary. This guy's just learning to do foot as well as hip. So there's just simply touching his hip with the target. He's not making any movement at this point, just touching his little hip. And you can hear the bridge happen right when that target touches his hip. Okay, and then the next thing that we might look for is we touch. It happens really fast. We touch the animal, move the target away a little bit, look for some movement towards it. So, whoops. In this case, you'll see she's touched and then begins to lift her leg. That's a movement towards moving into the fence line. So we're going to reinforce that. And you want to kind of look at all, you got to keep in mind the whole movement of the animal and how they're bearing their weight and when they might be ready to take that step. And I think that can really help you set yourself and the animal up for success. If they're standing and all their weight's on their right back foot and you're wanting them to do this, that's 2 movements they have to do. So if you can get the animal to kind of step forward, now the weight's on the back left foot, it's much easier to do this. So even though you're focused on the hip moving in, think about the whole animal and how they're positioned and how they're bearing their weight, and that'll really help you a lot. This is a few days later with that same little male elephant. And what you'll see here in a minute is he's going to actually take his first step into the hip target. That she's going to warm him up a little bit with just some head targets. And you can see he wants to turn his head towards the second target, but just reposition him and go back again. Touch him, move the target away, and there's a little bit of a step. Okay, and now in this case you can see she didn't actually touch and move the target away.
I'd go right
She
to
just
another
pres-
one and get her up against the,
She just presented the target, and the elephant knows to move into it. So these are some of the approximations that you can use, moving her closer and closer. This is a super aggressive elephant too. Moving her closer and closer to the fence. And eventually, I've shown you some other videos, and I'm not going to show you all those again, but eventually you might get to the point of eliminating the targets and just switching the behavior to a hand signal, which you see here. So this becomes, hopefully you're not dangling a bag of bread all the time. So this becomes the hand signal for lean in. Okay, so the idea being that you can start with targets as tools to teach the animals to do behaviors. They can also be used to cue behaviors, and you may choose to replace the targets as a cue with some other sort of cue, like a hand signal. And I think one of the coolest things that happens when you're training animals is what we call the aha moment, when they get it. And I hope you've all had the pleasure of experiencing this, when the animal goes, I understand what you want, yay! And they're super excited. And have y'all seen this video?
Yes, no,
So this is here. We do this training enrichment workshop. The Oakland Zoo's hosted it a number of times. And as part of that workshop, the participants have 3 training sessions to train a behavior for which they've written a shaping plan. And in this case, one of the camels was being trained to do a 360. And the 2 previous sessions, and the first part of this session, the animal kept turning and then coming back, and turning and coming back. And then this happened. And everybody was so excited. And this poor group, I mean, I think the last, we knew we were kind of pushing the session long, but they really just wanted to try to get a little more, and then she did it, and she totally knew when she did it right. It was the cutest thing ever. Does anybody have any fun aha moments you want to share?
I had a similar one with Max when I was an apprentice, and I swear if he could have glasses, he would need them, because I had to use a really large target because he can't see the little ones, but he kind of had a moment like that too, and it was just really great to see like a big turn, because you can go, they get really excited and they wiggle, and then they'll do a little dance around, and he really didn't like turning one direction, and he had to go up on this little platform, so it was just really cool to see kind of the whole process, and I mean it took, not that bright either, so it took a really long time, but it was very rewarding. Like, I think I was like screaming in the background, and then he was just so excited. So.
And then did he continue doing the behavior? Like that was
no
seriously
problem.
the breakthrough moment.
Yeah.
And like, I get it. Oh, that's
I'm
awesome.
like, wow, 6 months just it took so long for you to turn, but then after it was like he asked for it and he did it.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. And again, I think that's, I like to think about the enrichment value of training, and I think that's where you really see it with the sort of cognitive aspect of enrichment and training. And super cute. Okay, so now kind of similar to the lean in side present, I thought we'd go through some of the steps for shaping a foot present. And again, these might all be with the tiger. I actually can't remember. So just starting to present the target, you can see he's not real keen on it. Okay, so after the foot target's been presented, he's just not very happy with it at all, focused on hissing at it. So we need to train him to not be angry at the target. And taking opportunities to touch his foot, and then big reinforcement when that can happen. It's pouring down rain. So now his foot's up there, a little opportunistic, touch his foot. He's a little startled by it, but not too bad. And this was in one training session. Gail and I were, for those of you that know Gail, we're partners in a consulting company, and we were at the Seoul Zoo working with this tiger, and we were trying to show them how they could begin introducing the target. So this was in one training session. So unfortunately, I don't have the continuation of this particular animal learning this behavior, but the idea is similar to what you saw with the lean in. You would touch the foot, bring the target away, touch the foot, move the target where you want the foot to go, and eventually the animal begins to approximate that foot movement towards the target until they can get their foot to a location where you need them to be. You know, if it's a cat, maybe you want their foot presented like this so that you can treat the pads, or maybe you want it hung over the top so you can look at the nails. All depends on what you want out of the behavior. But the idea is you shape the movement with the target in small steps like this. Okay, so in this case, the bear is already standing up, so pretty easy to be opportunistic and capture just touching the target to the foot. And this could be a good place to start. It's similar to touching the hip or reaching in to touch the foot, but obviously the foot's already there. What you would want to work towards, rather than just touching and bridging, is touching. After you've done some touch and bridge, you want to touch and move the target some, because we use targets to elicit movements. We want the animal to move their body part towards a target. If all you do is okay, now I've taught you to move, but if I spend all my time just touching and bridging, I've basically trained you to sit still while I touch you. So be careful that if you're starting off with an animal already in a position like what you saw with the bear, that you're not just training that animal to sit still while you poke them. You might want to do that down the line for injection training or something like we were talking about again with the Siamangs this morning. You might want to train them to do that, but initially you want them to learn that concept of moving towards the target. So just think about that if you have animals, you know, like that might already be in a position where their foot's up against the mesh and you're training the foot. You can teach them, you can desensitize them to being touched, but there may be times where you want to then approximate their movement, their foot movement to a different location. Like with the bear, you might want to move it into a blood draw box. And if you've only taught him that when I touch you with the target, you stay still, now you're going to have to retrain the target as a tool to get movement, rather than something I poke you with and you stay still. Okay, staying with the foot theme. So you saw this little guy training earlier. You can see he's doing a lot of grabbing of the target. Okay, does he really know what happened? Not sure, kind of capturing it. So he's doing so much grabbing of the targets. For those of you that were here last time, I think I talked about the methods to eliminate undesirable behaviors. One of them is training an incompatible behavior. So in this case, grabbing at the foot target with his hands is not a desirable behavior. So we train him to hold a hand target, which then allows you to use the foot target to shape foot. Of course, that's not the video that's there. He should be holding a little yellow ball. So that is, again, more capturing, and I think he's kind of distracted by eating. So he's not necessarily paying attention to the foot target. Let's see what the next one is, shall we? Here we go. Okay, here he is holding his hand target and his foot target. And now he's actually starting to get the idea to move his foot towards the foot target. But you can see the little round target there. That was used in the middle of training. Maybe I have these all out of order. Okay, now she's starting to manipulate his foot some. He's completely ignoring the target with his hands, and she's able to start manipulating his toes, moving his toes a little bit with the target. Another shaping the foot. She's going to ask him to hold the target and then begin presenting the foot target. Obviously in a lab setting. And a little bit further in the training, you'll see the foot's beginning to be extended through the little opening there at the bottom. And you can see she's using the target and her hand. This is going to be the cue for foot. So in order to start moving from the target as the cue to the hand signal, she's presenting both and saying foot, and then eventually she'll move the target away and just have foot, and he'll bring his foot out to the hand target. Another good example of how you switch. Actually, I was just talking about this video this morning. So working with gibbons can be challenging because their arms are so long, and it's easy for them to get in different positions and still not do what you're asking them to do. So this was training this gibbon who already knew a number of behaviors, knew like hands and feet and belly, but she was trying to train shoulder and having a hard time getting these great big arms to move into a position for shoulder. So we used a hand target to shape him into the right position so that she could access the shoulder. So that's what you'll see. And there's also another gibbon working just over here, so you'll hear a lot of bridging. Okay, so she's going to use this target to stretch him across and then touch his shoulder with her finger to identify that's the body part we're talking about. But by using that hand target to help shape the position that she needs. So sometimes, I guess the point is, sometimes you use a target to touch the body part you want. Sometimes you can use a target to help move the animal into a position that then allows you to touch the desired body part. So again, targets are a tool. Think about how you can use them to help position animals to achieve whatever your objective is. Okay, getting close. All right, oh yeah.
I have a question. So all of this is protected contact, but like with lemurs, I have a problem because they're holding their balls, where like I would like down the road to have them present like hand and feet. And the reason why I trained the actual holding of the balls because they like to sit in your lap when you train, so I wanted them to have a the space. But then my other problem is now that they hold their ball and you start those behaviors, they don't want to offer anything up, or I can only touch the top of the hand and versus like the pad. Do you have any suggestions?
So it might be, and I'm just talking off the top of my head, since the video's running, that's what I'll say. You might want to change how their station is if you find that the station that you've trained is problematic. If, you can have them hold their ball and begin to reach their hand this way, which would put their hand in the right position. You could have them stand up on a T-stand or something. There might be another way that you position them that makes it easy, and then you teach them to lift their fingers. That might be a starting point, because when they lift their fingers, then that's a starting point to approximating the hand up. If they're comfortable turning their hand this way, maybe if your objective is to look at the palm of their hand, does it have to be this way or can it be this way?
Well, like they get a lot of like broken fingers and stuff, so it wouldn't be beneficial if I could see it all. But take what I can get to start.
And with a particular group of chimps I used to work with, because they had so many hand injuries. Chimps, tend to bite each other's fingers and toes. So it was multiple males in a group, and they had a lot of injuries to their hands. So we trained them to present their hand this way, and this way. So that you could, for that exact reason, because they had so many injuries that if you just trained, one aspect of it, it wouldn't give you the exam that you needed. So I think you can certainly teach them to discriminate different orientations, but maybe if you're finding that having that ball that they're so devoted to holding on to is problematic, you can always change your starting point. Okay, so this is another series of steps all run together, and this is training a chimpanzee for pill swallowing. Have y'all seen this series of videos? Some are saying yes, some are saying no. Okay, sorry for those of you who have seen it, you'll have to see it again. So this guy had leprosy, and he had to have a lot of medication, especially when it would flare up. And so he knew how to open his mouth, but he didn't extend his tongue. And when I've trained pill swallowing with different animals, I find that having them open their mouths and extend their tongues is kind of the starting point, because then the throat's open and you can get the pills in the back of the throat and then reinforce them for swallowing. But if they just do an open but they hold their tongue real tight, then if you throw the pills in, then they're going bleh, and the pills come back out. So the first point, or the starting point for him, was teaching him to extend his tongue. And that was done by targeting his tongue towards a tongue depressor. So the tongue depressor is used as a target, not to hold his tongue down. And because the steps go pretty quickly, I'm just going to tell you what they are, and then you can just watch it. So he does the open, he targets his tongue out, and then you'll see a straw go in, and that was to simulate the pillar, like the syringe pill popper things, because I tried throwing the pills in his mouth, but they were bouncing off his face. Terrible aim. So I started with a straw because I didn't have a pill popper, then put the piece of the straw on a syringe to do that. So that's what you're going to see in the video, is that series of steps. So you can see his tongue's pulled way back there.
Good boy. Open tongue. Tongue. Booty, you're bopping him on the head. Tongue.
So he's just being reinforced for moving his tongue, kind of getting the idea. And then he's starting to extend his tongue more, and desensitization to the straw.
Good boy.
So the criteria is keep his tongue on the tongue depressor while the pill popper goes in. And then building the duration of the pill popper being in his mouth.
Good. Oh, that was wonderful, Patty. That was really good. Tongue. Hold. Good.
And when I train pill swallowing, I usually first off, find out what kind of pills you need to give the animal, capsules, tablets, whatever it might be. And I like to train with something that's fairly neutral tasting, vitamin E, garlic tablets, and also something that doesn't matter if they happen to swallow a few of them at a time. But if you train with something that tastes bad and they chew on it, which inevitably they will, then they may not want to play your game anymore. If they chew on something that tastes good, then they're going to want to chew on it. So I like to train with something that's relatively neutral, to the best of my perception, relatively neutral to the animal. And this is the same behavior with elephants. Obviously in free contact, and what you can see is he threw the pills in and then swallowed up with juice. So what we like to do is reinforce taking the pills in the mouth and then some sort of liquid to help them swallow, and then reinforce when you actually see swallowing, once you're to that point. Some animals, if they've got cheek pouches or, little bags there, they'll pouch the pills and not actually swallow them. So you want to try to make sure that they're actually swallowing. And then I always have them open up after I think they've swallowed, just to check, make sure they're really gone. And to finish up, I'm just going to show you this series of training sharks for blood draw. So the first step is teaching the sharks to come up to the platform by touching a target. And there's 2 zebra sharks that are the focus of the training. It's super noisy aquarium stuff, so that's why I turned the volume down. So you can see they're not super great with their targeting yet, just learning it. Now they're starting to come to the target a little more reliably. You can see both of them coming in and actually following it. And then the next step was to start getting the animals comfortable with being rolled over. Once sharks are rolled over, they sort of go into a stupor. And you can see they're kind of fighting it. They're not super comfortable with it. And what you'll see is the animal's going to relax, and then that's when he lets it go. And he's pretty happy when the animal relaxes some.
Is he food reinforcing this behavior? Or
Yes. Yeah. So he's giving food. There's no bridge being used, no mechanical bridge with him. And you can see the second one's lined up, like, no, not your turn yet. And here you can actually see the food being given, yeah. So now you can see the animals are super calm, relaxed. He's not really restraining them. Beginning to sort of stroke down the animal's body close to where the blood draw will be, and then this is what the blood draw looks like. That's kind of where it's 12 o'clock. So if you all could be back at 12:30, I hope this has kind of given you an idea of breaking behaviors down into lots of small steps. When you come back at 12:30, be prepared to write a shaping plan. The shaping plan you will write is for making an ice cream sundae. And when you come back, I will show you the supplies that you have, and then you can sit down and write your shaping plan. And what you're going to do is exchange your shaping plan with somebody, and you have to make your ice cream sundae based on their shaping plan. So, I leave you with that. Yes, we'll come back at 12:30 and